Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening. I want to welcome you to the third session of the Komen Virtual Metastatic Breast Cancer Impact Series presented by Komen Atlanta. My name is Sierra McCann, and I am the Executive Director for Komen here in Atlanta. And while we wish that we could be here with you face-to-face in person at our second grader metastatic breast cancer conference, we are so honored that you have taken time out of your day to join us for this event this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are. So the great thing about a virtual event is that we do have an opportunity to reach a broader audience. And so we know that there are people joining us from Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, and all across the country. And so we are just so honored to have you here with us. I want to take a few seconds to thank our sponsors, Northside Hospital, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, AZI, Athenex Oncology, AstraZeneca, Puma Biotechnology, Seattle Genetics, Myriad Genetics, and Cancer Treatment Centers of America. We could not do this event without you, and we are so grateful for your friendship and your continued support of Komen. So today's program is really exciting, and we're again honored to have you here with us. We will have an oncologist discuss clinical trials, and we will also hear from an MBC thriver, and she will talk about her clinical trial journey. And so up next, let's hear from event manager Suzanne Patterson, who will go over some quick HUVA tips to ensure that you have the best possible experience within the HUVA platform. Suzanne?
Thank you for joining us today for the Komen Virtual MBC Impact Series. My name is Suzanne Patterson, and I manage events here at Susan G. Komen. I wanted to take a few moments to quickly walk you through some of the important features of the HUVA platform so you get the most out of your event experience today. If you're viewing today's event on your computer via HUVA's web application, be sure you're using Chrome as your web browser for the best viewing experience. In order to navigate around the HUVA platform, you will use the main navigation bar. You are currently viewing the web application and can find the main navigation bar in the upper left-hand side of the screen. If you are using the mobile app version of HUVA, you will use the bar at the bottom of the app to navigate to most features. The first section in the main navigation bar is the Home button. Use this at any time to get back to the main page. After the Home button, the next section is the Agenda. This is where you will locate the live stream for today's general session. After clicking on Agenda, you will then click on View Session, and this will take you to the session page. From the session page, you can also find the Q&A section to submit any questions. A few important notes about viewing the live stream. If at any point you lose sound, please exit out of the live stream and launch the live stream again. This should fix the majority of sound issues. Also, if you leave the session page to view other areas of the platform during the live stream, you will be disconnected from the live stream. You can return to the session page and rejoin the live stream again. Underneath the Agenda section is the Attendee section. You can click on this section to view the attendees of this event, view attendee profiles, and communicate privately with meeting attendees. In order to view the attendee profiles and communicate directly, you will need to use the mobile app. The next section under Main Navigation is the Community. This is a great area for getting to know other attendees and starting conversations on specific topics. Anyone can host a virtual meetup or start a new community discussion. We encourage you to take some time to explore this section and share your experiences with other attendees. After the community section, the next two areas are dedicated to our sponsors and exhibitors. If you're using the mobile app, the sponsor and exhibitor sections will be listed under additional resources. From the web application, you will find the sponsor and exhibitor areas listed under the main navigation. Please take some time to visit each of the sponsors and exhibitors to learn more about them and their support of Susan G. Komen. This event would truly not be possible without their support. Should you have any questions about using Whova, you can contact the event organizers in the community section and post a question to Ask the Organizers Anything. We will be checking the community boards at all times during the live event and we'll get right back to you. If you still need additional help, please feel free to reach out to me directly through email or phone. Please note that the Whova platform is not only available during the live events, but will be available for your continued use 24/7 throughout the Virtual Impact series over the next few months. We encourage you to use the community board sections for continued connections with others living with metastatic disease. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Suzanne. Now I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amelia Zelnak. Dr. Zelnak is a board-certified hematologist and medical oncologist with expertise in treating solid tumors, blood cancers, and hematologic disorders. She completed training in internal medicine and was a fellow in hematology and oncology at the Emory University School of Medicine. Prior to joining Atlanta Cancer Care, Dr. Zelnak was part of the faculty at Emory University in the Department of Hematology and Medical Oncology. Dr. Zelnak is part of the Northside Hospital Breast Care Committee, Northside Hospital Cancer Institute Breast Research Work Group, NHCI Research Advisory Committee. She is also a part of the Susan G. Komen Atlanta Advisory Council and the Georgia NCORE Clinical Research Team. We are so happy and honored to have Dr. Zelnak here with us. And while we are here, you can actually submit questions for our Q&A session in the chat. We want to make sure that you are not submitting personal questions, but we will do our best to answer all of your questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Amelia Zelnak.
Hi, my name is Amelia Zelnak. I'm a medical oncologist at Northside Hospital, and I'm honored to be with you this evening as we talk about metastatic breast cancer. I will be reviewing some of the basics about clinical trials and then talking specifically about some of the exciting developments over the past couple years with new drugs that have been approved for treatment of metastatic breast cancer based upon studies looking at the effectiveness compared to standard treatments in these patients. So with that, let me see if I can share my screen so that I can pull up my slides and get started. Let's see here. Great. So what is a clinical trial? So clinical trials are research studies that involve people. These are studies that are looking at new ways to prevent, detect, diagnose, or treat diseases. So in the context of a metastatic breast cancer clinical trial, they're looking at new ways of treating this disease. It might involve new drugs or new combinations of drugs. And the goal is to see whether or not this new treatment works and is safe. There are other types of clinical trials that can look at various aspects of care, such as improving quality of life. And certainly those are ongoing as well for patients with breast cancer. So broadly speaking, there are a number of different phases of clinical trials. Phase 1 clinical trials are the very first trials that are done with a new drug or drug combination. And typically only small numbers of patients, typically 15 to 30 patients, are enrolled. Oftentimes these patients do not have any standard therapy available. And these first in human studies start with the lowest dose of a drug that's often been tested in animals, and then look to see if you can gradually increase it without causing too much toxicity. Ultimately, these trials determine the maximum tolerated dose, and then that dose is then taken into larger studies. Patients in these trials are going to have a lot of tests and lab work done looking at how the drug's absorbed, metabolized, and excreted. Sometimes, and you see this more frequently over the past few years, if a drug looks particularly promising in the first part of the study that's done, you'll see something called a dose expansion cohort, where they're adding additional patients, oftentimes with specific types of cancer, to see if they can detect any kind of early signal of efficacy or activity, which would then prompt them to go into the next phase of clinical trials. So phase 2 clinical trials are conducted once the safety and dose of the drug has been evaluated, and then this is when they take it into a larger patient population. Here, you're not just looking at safety, now you're wanting to see, is this drug effective in a specific patient population. Typically, you want the response rates in this phase of a clinical trial to be as good or better than standard treatment, so that then you would be encouraged to move into a very large phase 3 trial. These phase 2 trials are sometimes single arm, and let me explain what that means. That means that everybody gets the same treatment, as opposed to having one arm get the new treatment and the other arm get standard treatment. So sometimes you'll see single arm phase 2 trials, sometimes they will be randomized. And the number of patients in these studies ranges widely. Sometimes you'll see a 30 to 40 person trial, or sometimes you can see several hundred patients put in these phase 2 clinical trials. It's not very common for drugs to be approved based on data from a phase 2 clinical trial, mainly because it hasn't been stacked up in a large population against the standard treatments. But certainly you will see drugs that are very promising sometimes get accelerated approval, meaning the FDA says we're going to go ahead and let this drug be approved based on phase 2 data, knowing that the phase 3 trial is either well underway or nearing completion. Now, I'll show you an example of that later on in the talk. So what are phase 3 clinical trials? So these are the big clinical trials that are undertaken when a drug has demonstrated safety and encouraging efficacy in the early phase studies, and then they want to do a very large phase 3 trial. And oftentimes these studies are used to obtain FDA approval, and they provide the adequate data for the product package insert, so the information that's sent out to patients and providers. Typically, these phase 3 trials compare a new drug, or sometimes it's a new combination, with standard therapy in a very randomized, or in a randomized and very controlled manner. Oftentimes, large numbers of patients are on these studies. Many hundreds to thousands of patients can be enrolled, so that the drugs are evaluated in a larger patient population, and not just at 1 or 2 sites, but at many institutions. And oftentimes, these are done globally in multiple countries. So you can see here that the first part of the drug development, animal lab research in phase 1, can take up to 4+ years. The early phase trials, phase 1 and 2, take another couple years. And then by the time a drug gets FDA approval, it's often been studied for well over 10 years. And even after these drugs are approved, they then are continually monitored for unknown toxicities or things that are observed in patients that weren't seen in the studies. That phase 4 monitoring can continue to go on. So who actually sponsors these clinical trials? Well, the largest sponsor of studies typically tends to be these pharmaceutical companies that are looking to develop the new drugs that they can then take to market. And as I've mentioned, the phase 1 trials are typically done at a very small number of sites. The phase 2 and 3 trials are often conducted at a larger number of institutions. Sometimes there's something called investigator-initiated clinical trials, And these are studies that would be designed by an investigator. So think, oftentimes it's academic physicians. So they're designed by the physician, and they're funded by the pharmaceutical company, but that investigator's institution is the one that does a lot of the monitoring for the study. There are also a number of national clinical trials networks. Certainly there are a number of options here where cancer research is regularly performed. You may have heard of groups like Alliance or NRG, ECOG, Akron, SWOG, Children's Oncology Group, where the pediatric cancer studies are done. And all of these groups meet regularly throughout the year. Of course, this year's been virtual, like many things, but they are the groups that are designing these studies that are then put out to the member institutions. There's also the NCORP, and certainly that's very familiar to me because Northside is a member of the Georgia NCORP. And this is a program where community research programs have access to these NCI-sponsored trials. So the NCI-sponsored trials are not just done in the academic setting. Many of the patients that are accrued to the studies actually go on in the community. There are a number of other clinical trial consortiums that you'll hear about, where these are groups or institutions that get together and open up studies together. So how does the provider fit into this? So, you know, my job as the oncology provider is to help patients make the best decision about their care. And oftentimes when patients have disease progression of their metastatic breast cancer, that's the time when clinical trials really come into play. So the provider is often the one that is bringing up the option of a clinical trial, certainly if they have an option for the patient there at their institution. However, many times it's the patients that are asking and inquiring, do you have a study? Is there somewhere I should go to look at doing a clinical trial? And so it's very important that the patients are their own advocates for participation. I think every patient should have access to a clinical trial. That may not always be right where you are. Certainly, or if you're in a more rural setting, it's difficult to think that you're going to have clinical trial access right there. But oftentimes, your local oncologist may be networked in with a group where you can be referred in for clinical trial consideration. And every healthcare provider needs to be comfortable with talking about clinical trials with their patients, because ultimately, our job is to help you make the best decision for your care. And clinical trial participation can be complex. It can often be burdensome in terms of what we ask of the patients, as far as the number of treatment or clinic visits and extra tests and things. So understanding what is involved with clinical research is critical when making a decision about what you think is best to do. So people go into clinical trials for a bunch of different reasons. Many do it because they want to help others that may face the same illness that they're facing at a later date. Patients want to contribute and move the science forward, and certainly I've heard that from a number of patients through the years that have enrolled on clinical trials, is that they feel like they're part of something bigger than just their own care. And many times patients go on clinical trials because they hope they're going to receive the newest treatment and want to have that additional care and attention from the clinical research staff that's provided when they're treated on study versus the standard treatment. So how do you find out about trials? And this can be very complicated, I think, for patients, because there are a number of tools online, but ultimately that doesn't necessarily help you find a study that's a good fit for you. So you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and you can see the website listing here. And you'll note over here on the left, you can explore over 350,000 research studies all over the country and the world. So unless you really start doing very tailored searches within this website, it can be quite challenging to find a study that's a good fit for you. Certainly you can start to narrow it down by putting in additional conditions or diseases, or narrow it down to which country you want to go to. You can search within geographic ranges. So there are a number of things that you can do to help. I also would encourage you to think about looking online at other cancer centers that are close to you that may potentially be an option. So first, of course, you're going to talk with your own provider and find out, do they have an option for you? And if they do, that's fantastic. Sometimes that's the best study is the one that's the most convenient study, just because you don't have to travel, and the amount of logistics involved can be much simpler. But certainly looking online, like I was mentioning, at places nearby, certainly places that are drivable, and that's even more important now during COVID. The likelihood of patients hopping on a plane and flying back and forth a couple times a month to go enroll on a clinical trial is just, logistically challenging. But I think that is an important question to ask, though, is are you willing to travel to go on a trial? I've got a patient right now who essentially, she just moved to Boston. She and her husband, they don't have any children. They had the wherewithal, a friend up in the area to stay with. And so they're living up in Boston while she's on a clinical trial up there, which is working for her. But that's just a tremendous amount of sacrifice to make. The other thing I would mention is that GeorgiaCancerInfo.org has a search tool for trials in Georgia. And I think that can often be a great starting point for patients, because you can see what are the other studies going on close by. Certainly here in Metro Atlanta, there are a number of sites that regularly have metastatic breast cancer studies. At Northside, we have a number of trials. Emory has a number of Cancer Treatment Centers of America, Northwest Georgia. And you can go really to a number of places in the area and have access to clinical research. So one of the next questions you need to ask is, well, am I eligible for a clinical trial? And this can vary from one trial to the next. These research trials have very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. And it's not just based on whether or not there's a trial available. Things like, do you have diabetes or heart disease? Now with some of these immune therapies, do you have a prior autoimmune disease such as Crohn's or lupus? Those things all go into play when the research staff is looking at, are you eligible? If you have inadequate liver and kidney function, that can be a problem. And this, I know, I can tell you a story about a patient just this past year who was a perfect candidate, so we thought, for a clinical trial. But her liver function, which was good when we initially started talking to her about it, really just started getting worse very quickly from her cancer. And so even though she looked like a good candidate initially, I ultimately decided that she needed to get treated off study because her liver function was not adequate. Performance status, you may wonder, what is that? That's really just how active are you? Are you up and about? Are you spending much of your time sitting during the day, or are you pretty active? Some studies will exclude patients that have a lot of toxicity from their prior treatment. So a classic one that you'll see is neuropathy. So certainly if a new drug can cause peripheral neuropathy, the study designers are reluctant to include patients that already have a fair amount of that toxicity from prior treatment. This can be a problem for breast cancer patients, since a number of our active standard therapies can cause that numbness and tingling. So typically that can be an issue for patients as well. Some trials allow patients for brain metastases, allow patients that have brain metastases, and other studies exclude them. A prior cancer diagnosis can sometimes exclude you as well. Not always, but many times if you've had cancer, even if it was 5 years ago, they may say that you're not eligible. One of the things that I keep a track of in my mind, though, when thinking about eligibility, is the number of prior therapies that a patient's had. So some studies require that you've had at least 1 or 2 treatments for metastatic breast cancer. Some may not let you have more than a certain number. So oftentimes you can have a study where you might not have had enough treatment, or you might have had too much. If it's that you haven't had enough, then sometimes that means, well, why don't you go ahead and get standard treatment for this next treatment option, and then we'll look at this same clinical trial when your cancer progresses on this therapy. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that clinical trial option is off the table completely. It may just be that it's not quite the right time. So what are the costs? So one of the things that you need to understand is that when you go on a clinical trial, it often takes an extra week or two to get started on the treatment. And this is in contrast to what would be happening with standard of care treatment. So if I saw you in my clinic this week and your cancer looked worse on your scans, I'd typically talk with you about, well, what are we going to do next? And if it's another IV or another standard treatment, we would start that as soon as the next week. When you're enrolling on a clinical trial, you often have to take an extra week or two to do additional testing or to have the research staff make sure that you're eligible. And typically this isn't a problem, but every now and then you run into trouble where someone's liver function may be getting worse too quickly, or for whatever reason they feel like they need to begin treatment right away. There are also sometimes tests where you have to send things off to a central lab to confirm, findings before you can enroll. Some of the studies require additional tests. The scans are often more frequent, and the labs are often more cumbersome than they would have been off study. Anything that is done on the study that you would not have done otherwise should be paid for by the trial. And there are whole departments of people at these research places that are making sure that the study gets billed for what they're supposed to get billed for, and then that your insurance gets billed for what they're supposed to get billed for. The other thing I would just mention in terms of cost is that there are extra study visits during the trial, particularly during the first 1 to 2 months. And so that's where that travel time to a place that may be far away can come into play. So why is research important? Well, clinical trials have added to our knowledge about metastatic breast cancer and have helped us improve care. If you look at the improvement in survival over the past several decades, much of it has been generated by gains in survival due to new medications. Unfortunately, many patients don't participate, and about 2% of the US population in general is on a clinical trial, and only 5 to 8% of adults actually participate in studies. And even more so, it's a problem where minority groups are often underrepresented in these trials. So why is participation low? A lot of it is just lack of knowledge, lack of access, and then just the overall demand the demands of being in a study can be complex. So questions to ask yourself when thinking about, should you go on a study? What am I trying to get out of it? What are my goals? Am I potentially looking for my own personal benefit? Am I thinking more about benefiting those that come after me? How do you feel about the unknown? It's very possible that you may be on the standard of care arm, which I always tell patients is what you would have gotten treatment-wise if you hadn't been on the study, but some people just aren't comfortable with that. You need to think through the level of risk, and certainly you'll be given an informed consent form that details all the different side effects that might happen on the study, and those can often be intimidating themselves, but you need to carefully weigh that. And then you have to think through, does this fit into my life? How does my family feel? Are they going to be supportive of me going on a study? You need to ask your doctor, why is this study being done? Like, what's the purpose? Why do you think I'm a good fit? How often am I going to need to come in? Extra tests, procedures, how am I going to be there that day? And then, of course, carefully consider whether the study's covered by my insurance. And often you can just make a simple phone call to your insurance company to ask questions about clinical trial participation. So there are a lot of myths about trials too, that it's only for people in whom there are no other options. Some people have the myth that there's always a placebo, that there's not actually going to be any treatment involved, that they're being experimented on, and then there's the myth that they're always free as well. So with that being said, I just want to focus a little bit on metastatic breast cancer and some of the new drugs that have been developed over the past couple years. As things stand right now, more than a quarter of patients are living more than 5 years, and certainly we want that number to go up, and that depends on new treatment options. And as you all know, the treatment for breast cancer really depends upon the receptor status and extent of disease. And broadly speaking, there are 3 different categories that we'll go through separately today: hormone receptor positive, HER2 positive, and triple negative. And by no means do I mean this to be an exhaustive talk. I just want to highlight some of the clinical trials that have happened to encourage you to participate yourself. So with hormone receptor positive breast cancer, one of the game changers over the past several years has been the approval of 3 drugs that are CDK4/6 inhibitors. And these drugs basically slow down the growth of the cell by inhibiting one of the proteins involved in cell cycle. So this here, and I'm just going to go through this briefly so that you understand what these curves look like. So when a trial is conducted, one of the main things that we look at is, well, how long are people on one treatment versus another? And obviously you want to be on the treatment, the better treatment is going to control the disease for longer. So this is what these curves often look like. So PFS is progression-free survival, which essentially means how long is it before my scan looks worse. And so what you can see is that the folks that are in the blue treatment group, so that's the group that got palbociclib or Ibrance, that's the trade name, added into their standard hormone therapy, you can see that they were on their treatment on average for longer than the patients that got letrozole alone. There have been a whole bunch of studies done with these drugs because, as I mentioned, there are 3 of them. Palbociclib was approved in 2015. And then ribociclib and abemaciclib were approved in 2017. Hard to believe it's already been 5 years since we've had palbociclib. But the one thing I want to highlight when you look here, look at the number of patients that were on these studies, right? Several thousand women participated in these trials that have now led to a change in the disease course for so many women that are treated in the first-line setting with one of these 3 drugs. There's another medication that was approved in May of 2019. This one is called alpelisib, and it's hitting a different target. It's targeting PIK3CA. And about 40% of breast cancer patients that are hormone receptor positive have a mutation in this. And you can see here again, the group that got fulvestrant, so hormone therapy with alpelisib, did much better than the group that did not. And what you can see too, just looking at the top group versus the bottom, and the top panel, those are the patients that had the mutation, whereas the bottom panel are those that did not. So here you can see, can you imagine if they had done a clinical trial where they only allowed patients that did not have mutations? You wouldn't have seen the benefit. And so that's where, like I mentioned earlier, the eligibility criteria can be really important. So for hormone receptor positive breast cancer, we still have a number of unanswered questions, looking at evaluating the addition of other agents to these CDK4/6 inhibitors. There's questions about the sequencing of therapy. We saw some really encouraging data just this past weekend about using abemaciclib in the early stage setting to help prevent recurrences. And then there's also ongoing studies looking at some of these new immunoconjugates or antibody drug conjugates to see if they can also have a role in endocrine resistant disease. So HER2 positive breast cancer. So HER2, as many of you know, is a growth factor that sits on the surface of the cell and picks up growth signals that then make these cancer cells grow really, really fast. And about 20% of breast cancers have HER2 overexpression. There are a bunch of drugs that target the HER2 protein. Some target the outside part of the protein, so that would be pertuzumab and trastuzumab. And then these new drugs like TDM1 and DS8201 target the outside. Then there are drugs that hit the tyrosine kinase domain, and you'll see those here in green, lapatinib, neratinib, and tucatinib. So those are shutting down the signaling on the inside of the cell. So trastuzumab or Herceptin seems like it's been around forever, but it actually was approved in 1998. It single-handedly, I think, changed the course of this disease much more so than really anything else over the past 30 years. And this drug was approved based on an improvement in response and overall survival. It's been tweaked, right, through the years, right? So initially, patients would have gotten a taxane-based therapy plus trastuzumab or Herceptin. And we've looked at how can we make that better. So this is a trial, the Cleopatra trial, where over 800 women were treated with the standard treatment listed there in gray versus the yellow treatment where pertuzumab or Perjeta was added in. And what you can see here again is that the progression-free survival, so the time that patients were on that first treatment, was better when the Perjeta or pertuzumab was added in compared to not. And here you can see, look at this overall survival. So people are living longer because of this new medication. And so this was approved back in 2012, which now, again, it's been standard of care for many years. There have been other drugs like TDM1 that have come along. So this is another large trial, 980 patients. And I had a patient that was, a number of patients actually on this study back when I was still working at Emory. This study looked at TDM1 versus standard therapy. Again, you can see here, wow, patients did better. So if they got the TDM1 compared to the other treatment. And you can see here again, patients live longer. So this was approved in 2013. So what about some more recent approvals? So HER2CLIMB was a trial that was open at a bunch of different sites here in Georgia. So it was exciting to see so many women from Georgia be a part of this, including some patients that I treated. And so this was a trial of about 600 women who received either capecitabine and trastuzumab. So again, everybody got the standard treatment, but half of the patients got tucatinib and the other half did not. And when you look here, progression-free survival was improved significantly by the addition of the tucatinib, right? The blue line looks better than the red. And this drug was just FDA approved back in April, which is one of the more recent FDA approvals. One of the exciting things about this trial is that they did allow patients with with brain metastases to go on, and nearly half the patients had brain metastases. And this addition of tucatinib also improved the responses in the central nervous system. So that was just really exciting. It's the first medication that's really been shown to definitively do that for HER2 positive disease. So this drug, tucatinib, is now moving up into earlier line settings. So this study was basically done in patients that had had at least 2 prior treatments. And so now the HER2CLIMB-2 trial is underway, where they're looking at TDM1 with or without tucatinib to see if this can help improve long-term outcome as well. So what about this drug, DS-8201? It's also called trastuzumab deruxtecan. The trade name is Enhertu. So this is an example of a drug that was approved based on phase 2 data alone. So they had not yet seen their phase 3 randomized controlled trial data, but the data from the single-arm phase 2 trial was so promising, looking at responses, that this drug was granted accelerated approval last December, pending the results of a larger phase 3 trial. I can still remember sitting at San Antonio last year, back when we were still going to meetings in person, and the data for DS-8201 as well as HER2CLIMB was presented. And one of my patients had actually participated in both of these trials. She was on HER2CLIMB with me and then had traveled across town to Piedmont to go on the trastuzumab deruxtecan trial. Amazing that one patient could have been part of both of these studies and had a meaningful impact on the approval of these medications in a way that future patients will benefit. So lastly, I just want to talk about triple-negative breast cancer. As you know, this is a very aggressive cancer that has a high propensity to metastasize. The poor outcome with patients with advanced disease is multifactorial, but is thought to be associated to these cancers being resistant to chemotherapy. And there's also been a lack of molecular targets to which novel agents can be developed. So there are a number of chemotherapy agents that we regularly use as standard treatment options for these patients. And these often serve as the control arm for clinical trials that are looking at a new drug versus standard of care. So certainly immune therapy has had a role to play with atezolizumab being approved for frontline metastatic breast cancer. And this was based on the Impassion 130 trial, in which 900 patients were randomized between standard nab-paclitaxel or Abraxane therapy with or without atezolizumab. And what you can see, and this is a very busy slide, but if you go look at the top right corner, what you can see there is that patients that had expression of this protein that is potentially that makes you more sensitive to immune therapy, that subset of patients, which was about 40% of patients, did better with the addition of atezolizumab versus when you look on the left at the overall population, you couldn't see a significant difference. So this drug was approved to be given along with nab-paclitaxel in March of 2019. There's been a good bit of discussion recently, though, about is this going to hold up, because it was given accelerated approval, but a confirmatory study that was done, basically very similar trial, but instead of using albumin-bound or nab-paclitaxel, they used paclitaxel. So Taxol, the standard one that you would see often in clinic, with atezolizumab. And this study was actually negative. So I'm just quoting here from the FDA, this press release that said, the FDA will review the findings of Impassion 131 and will communicate new information regarding these results and any potential changes to prescribing information. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this, because there clearly was, if you go back and look here in the bottom right, there was a survival advantage, meaning patients lived longer if they were PD-L1 positive and got the atezolizumab. And it's hard to know what to make of that, if there were slight differences in the patients that were enrolled on the trial, or if you just got lucky in one study and then the other study was negative. So we'll see. There may be additional information that comes forth looking at continued role of atezolizumab. So finally, I want to talk about sacituzumab govitecan, which is a new immunoconjugate that is now available for our patients with metastatic triple-negative breast cancer. And this study was done as a single-arm trial that showed excellent response rates of about 30%. And this was done in just 69 patients. And so what then happened is a single-arm study was undertaken with 110 patients that were that all received sacituzumab govitecan. The key eligibility criteria are listed below, and they were followed until they had progression or unacceptable toxicity. And as you can see here, the patients had excellent responses. The response rate was 34%, with the clinical benefit rate being 45%. Based on this data, this drug was given accelerated approval in April of 2020. And I had a number of patients that participated in the randomized phase 3 trial, one of whom participated in this event last time that we met a year and a half ago, and I still recall having a wonderful lunch with her after we met. But it's exciting to see this drug now in the clinic, and studies are underway looking at this for patients with hormone receptor positive breast cancer as well. So with that, I will include by saying that the improvement in survival rates for metastatic breast cancer patients has depended upon the willingness of brave patients to participate in clinical trials. The FDA approval of new drugs depends upon positive results from these trials. And so I just encourage you to always consider participating in a study, because the future improvement in outcomes for all of our patients is going to depend on your willingness to seek out and participate in clinical trials. So with that, I will conclude and be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Zelnak. We are actually going to hold our questions. We have had a couple come in, but after we hear from our next panelists, we will take some questions and we'll go ahead and get some time with Dr. Zelnak and Dr. Allen. So now we have Shauntice Allen. Dr. Allen is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Health Services in the University of Alabama at Birmingham School of Public Health. Her research program has a strong prevention focus at both the individual and community levels, where she explores the inextricable link between environmental exposures, race, and place. Dr. Allen has thrived with metastatic breast cancer since October 2015 after an initial stage 1 diagnosis in 2012 and has participated in several clinical trials. She volunteered with the Angel Squad of the Interdisciplinary Breast Health Center at UAB's Kirkland Clinic since 2003. Dr. Allen also enjoys live outdoor music festivals, traveling, and spending time with her family. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Shauntice Allen.
Hi, my name is Shauntice Allen, and I am currently living with metastatic breast cancer. I just want to thank Susan G. Komen of Greater Atlanta for hosting this webinar and this incredibly important discussion on participation in clinical trials. I was asked to just kind of share, when I was diagnosed and how I found out about trials. What motivated me or why did I decide to participate in any, and just some pros and cons or positive and negatives of my experience. So as I mentioned, my name is Shauntice Allen. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and I was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer in October of 2012. And I thought that was interesting that I was diagnosed during Breast Cancer Awareness Month in 2012. But it was stage 1. Left breast, no lymph node involvement after having had the biopsy, and of course after the surgery, them kind of looking at margins, and there wasn't any indication of any metastasis anywhere or spread. So I did surgery first, and I had a mastectomy of the left breast with reconstruction all in one swoop. So it was a pretty big surgery that day. And then followed that up with 4 months of chemotherapy starting in January of 2013. And after that, I, was told, go on and live your life, come back every 6 months just to see my breast oncologist for check-ins. And that's what I did. And so fast forward to October 2015, again, October, which I also think is just very ironic that a lot of things happened in October for me. I learned that my tumor markers were increasing, and just slightly. It wasn't big spikes, but still something to watch. So I was having blood work done every month for a consecutive 3 months. And we kept seeing on those labs that things were going up. So there needed to be something else done. So my oncologist ordered a PET scan, and that PET scan showed metastasis of the breast cancer to, at that time, my liver and lung. So we had to, I had to figure out what to do next. And I will say this about having a good care team in your corner. It truly is a team effort. It's not one person making a decision. It's a collective decision-making process. And I'm very thankful that I had an oncologist who really felt that way and thought that way. So I was very involved in the discussions, the talking, the weighing of what should we do next. I had a lot of input and opportunity to say how I felt about that. So again, diagnosed in 2012, October 2012, stage 1, re-diagnosed with metastatic disease in October of 2015. How I found out about clinical trials was honestly, I live in Birmingham, as I mentioned, and so I'm getting my care at an academic medical center, which is very research focused. There is an NCI designated cancer center where I live, and that's where I receive my care now. So lots of clinical trials are going on in a number of different disease areas, not just in cancer, but because there is a cancer center there certainly is emphasis on that. I will also say that clinical trials are not last resorts. I think there's a myth that somehow if one is offered a trial opportunity, that means that your disease has progressed so much that there's nothing else to do, that's standard of care, and that's not true. But that wasn't initially what I was going to do, actually, was go into a trial. So after I learned of the metastasis in 2015, it was some standard of care work or treatments that I received first. And I was still having some progression, particularly in the lung area. So my oncologist, again, who is a phenomenal clinician as well as a researcher, and actually who's not at my cancer center anymore, but at the time, was very focused on really trying to understand, you know, how he was very interested in triple negative breast cancer. I'm actually triple positive, and still am, but very interested in just research of breast cancer, period, and very committed to that. So I was grateful and thankful for that. My decision to actually enter into a trial was really because I wanted to get the absolute best care that I could. And so I did, and I've actually been in 4 different clinical trials since 2016. And all of them have been phase 1 research trials as well. So a lot of work goes into being in these studies. And I think that's something that's really important for patients to understand, is that there's work involved and there's effort and input and investment that's involved in being in a clinical trial. It's a lot of time. It's additional blood work. It is additional visits depending on what type of trial that you're in. The very first clinical trial that I was in, the very first day 1, cycle 1, I was in a research unit from 7 a.m. in the morning until 1:30 a.m. the next morning, because they were doing PK or lab draws every so many hours, and I had to stay. So they actually had to get additional nursing staff to be called in to just to take care of me. So it's a lot of time. And then I had to get up the very next morning and go back for another 24-hour blood draw. So if you don't live in a particular area where there is that kind of research going on, if you're getting your care at a regional or more local hospital, that can be a burden on someone to have to stay overnight or have to get a hotel room or have to manage how they're going to, you know, logistically do this in order to participate. So I think that's something that clinicians and providers need to make sure their patients understand, is the time commitment to these trials. The exclusion and the inclusion criteria, I think is also interesting. I am now living with metastatic disease where I have brain metastasis as well. I learned about that in 2019, last year. And so a lot of trials, you know, kind of before then, I wouldn't have been able to be a part of them because you were excluded if you had brain mets. And I think that's important to understand, as well as that the type of breast cancer one has, the type of metastasis, where it's gone, is important to have that conversation with patients about, so that they know and understand what their options are. But again, clinical trials are not last resorts. I enrolled in my very first study, the one that I mentioned, where I was there at 7 a.m. in the morning until 1:30 the next morning. And it was a really long day and a really long night into the next morning. And, you know, I spent a lot of time looking at the consent form, reading it, trying to understand it, asking questions. I think it's important to give patients that time to do that. Don't shove, you know, a 40-plus page consent form in someone's face and say, here, sign this, and think that that's okay to do. That didn't happen to me. I'm just saying that shouldn't happen to anyone. And also treat people with all kinds of respect. You know, I happen to actually work at the institution where I'm receiving my care. So I'm seen as a little bit of a rock star, I guess, because I'm there, I'm still working, but I'm also going through these various clinical trials, or have gone through. a number of them. Again, as I mentioned, all phase 1, so all requiring a lot of time. But even though somebody doesn't have that kind of advantage or they don't have that position, that doesn't mean that they don't need to be fully informed about what these trials are and what all of their options are, particularly with women of color or those who may be coming from another state or place where a provider may look at them and say that this person doesn't have any support, therefore they wouldn't be able to participate in the trial. Just present the option and let the patient give you the yay or nay. Don't assume that they don't want to know about clinical trials. And also don't assume that they would say no, because you just don't know. If you don't tell people about it, you really won't know whether or not they're interested. So those are some of the things that certainly have been my experience with these trials. I've been on oral medications. I've been on infusion drugs. As I mentioned, in 2019, I learned that I had brain mets. So I've had radiation to the brain, stereostatic radiation, and that's been interesting as well. I mean, you don't know what you don't know until you do this, and that's not a trial issue. It's just talking about knowledge and understanding and being prepared for these things. It's just so critically important that patients have the option to ask as many questions as they can, as they want to, the time that they need to make that decision as to whether or not they want to go into a trial or not, the ability to talk to a clinical nurse coordinator or whomever might be kind of managing their care. And that's another important person as well in a trial. It's not just the physician or the oncologist, but the person who's actually kind of helping you to schedule these things. It's important to talk to the patient. Some of my experience was I was getting scheduled for various scans or blood draws, and it would just happen, and I had not been spoken to about it, and I was working and still am. So, and there were times where I was like, I can't do that. I'm traveling or I'm doing something else, and so you have to talk to me before you just make the appointment. Don't assume that people are sitting around just waiting for you to schedule their life, because they aren't. So that's another important aspect, as well as just the communication. I think is really important. Giving people all of the information that they could possibly ask for, and giving them time to make that decision as to what they want to do, and being fine with them saying no if they decide not to participate in a trial. It's okay. Nobody should be penalized for saying no, because we all have the right to do that. So those are just some of my things, that my experience with it. I hope this has been helpful and informative for those who are working with individuals who have metastatic breast cancer. And I'm happy again to participate in this activity with Komen of Greater Atlanta. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Shauntice, for sharing your story and your experience with clinical trials. So we are going to open the floor for questions from tonight's panelists, both Shauntice and Dr. Zelnak. And we want to make sure that we are mindful of everyone's time, and we do want to answer as many questions as possible. And again, just a reminder, let's refrain from asking any questions that are deeply personal. We want to make sure that we're getting everyone's questions in tonight. So the first question that we have is for Dr. Zelnak, and it is going to be, is there a way to find out which studies are currently open or might be opening in the near future?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
I know I'm having a little trouble with my video feed, but so in terms of finding out which studies are open, certainly if you're looking within Georgia, one of the best places to go would be the georgiacancerinfo.org website, where they have listed the clinical trials that are open in Georgia. And you can look specifically for breast cancer studies and see if a study is open at a place close to where you live. I think if you're looking at other academic places, then, oh, there we go. Now you can see me. If you're looking at other academic centers where you might travel, it's probably easiest to go to their website and then look there at the individual places. Finding out which studies are potentially opening in the future can be tricky even for us in the oncology field. We often hear about a study that's coming up through our conversation with pharmaceutical companies or through national meetings. So that's typically where I hear about it. I think it's harder for a patient to, to have access to that type of information. Shauntice, did you have any comments, Dr. Allen, about how you are hearing about, other than through UAB, how you might hear about some studies?
Yeah, I'm a clinicaltrials.gov girl, so it's kind of bookmarked on my computers. But honestly, it's through my care team is how I'm finding out about it. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you both for answering that question. So the next question that we have, I'm going to pitch it to both of you. And so the question is, are clinical trials that patients qualify for presented to them by their care team, or do patients need to research themselves and advocate for their participation? And I know that Shauntice, you briefly touched on this, but if you could delve a little deeper and just let us know if people really need to advocate for themselves, or if this is information that their care team will provide for them.
Both. You need to advocate for yourself and ask questions about those options for clinical trial participation. And then it's also, I think it's important as a patient to really do your due diligence to find out about what you're getting yourself into. I honestly didn't know about the time commitment for some of these trials until I got into the trial. Even though, you read a consent form and it tells you that these are some things that you're going to experience in terms of additional scans or more appointments, you really don't know what that looks like until you actually start doing it. So it might be that you need to do a scan after the first round or two of some particular medicine that you've received, and that scan date or during that time frame, you may have already scheduled yourself to be out of town for that week of time. So then you have to kind of backtrack and figure out how to make yourself available for that, because it's a part of the study. It's something that has to be done. So I think it's both. You have to advocate for yourself, ask all those questions, or as many as you can at the time of the information being presented to you. And then, of course, also just really keeping that conversation open, that line of communication open with your care team is important.
Great, thanks. Dr. Zelnak, did you want to add on to that?
I mean, I think, for patients that have metastatic disease, the care team plays a huge part of knowing whether or not they have a clinical trial right there at their institution. If you've got a physician that's regularly engaged in research, so when I'm seeing patients, I'm regularly talking to them if I know they're eligible for a study. But if you're not at a place where there's a lot of clinical trials, I think it really does fall more on the patients to be their own advocate and ask those questions. And typically for a metastatic patient, the time to go on a study is when your cancer's gotten worse. I mean, I think you heard that in Dr. Allen's story, right? That she's been on one trial and then on another, and she's switched trials at a time where she's needed to switch treatment. So anytime your scans look worse, which is always just a very stressful time, right? You're trying to figure out what to do. The thought should be in your head, is the best treatment option what I can do here? Or do I need to look for the opportunity to go on a trial? If it's not here, do I need to go somewhere else? And so I think depending on what your care team looks like, you may be able to get that information readily from your own physician, or you may need to go looking around and then kind of poke them a little bit and say, what do you think about these things? Certainly, I know for me with my patients, I'm always thinking, what do I have right here? Because that's from a time and sacrifice standpoint going to be the most convenient for them, right? I mean, Shauntice, it's been great because she's at an academic center, but many metastatic breast cancer patients do not live really, really close to a place where there's tons of clinical trial access. So I think trying to figure out how that can work for each patient is different.
Right. Thank you. Shauntice, did your clinical trials, and forgive me, I just want to get some clarity here. So you did mention that you participated in 4 clinical trials. Now, did those progressively build upon one another, or were each of those trials independent of one another?
It was a little bit of both. The very first trial that I was in was it was an immunotherapy study, and which was great. It worked really well for the lung mets that I had going on at that time. But the subsequent trials that I've been in, some of them have been because I needed to, actually for the first one, I needed to have been in 2 lines of treatment before I could actually get into that trial. So I was on some standard of care stuff prior to getting into the immunotherapy study. Some of the others had been, it had been because of progression, but they weren't necessarily, they didn't build on each other. Some of them we were trying to figure out what's the best approach for what's going on in the lung or what's happening in the liver. So we were, it's kind of this, I hate to call it like a whack-a-mole type of thing, but it's one of those things where you're trying to find like the right sweet spot for dealing with one's disease. And everybody's breast cancer is different, by the way. I mean, every single person who living with metastatic disease or not, your experience, your life experience is different with your cancer. But it wasn't necessarily a build upon thing all the time. It was sometimes like, we got to find this thing that's really going to work well for her based on where she is right now with this particular issue. I mean, the trial that I had been in for the brain mets had nothing to do with the other trials. It was more about, because I've been on to catnip, and it's worked wonders. Actually, I literally was had an MRI yesterday and was so thrilled to know that there's stability and there hasn't been any new growth. But that was a trial that I was in because we really needed something that crossed blood-brain barrier. So it didn't have anything to do with some of these other issues. It was really about focusing on that at the time. So it's kind of been a little mixture, I guess, of both. Not necessarily always independent, but not quite always building on.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you for sharing. I do want to ask you an additional question that kind of builds upon, piggybacks off of what we just discussed, which is, do you feel more responsibility or pressure to participate in clinical trials as an African American woman? Because as stated earlier, we know that oftentimes there's a distrust or that there are fears within the community associated with participating in these types of trials. So do you feel any additional pressure or responsibility to participate?
That's an interesting question. There are times that I do, and then times that I don't. You know, when you're in the thick of it and you're having to make some life decisions about what's the next move, I'm not thinking about doing this for, Black girl magic reasons. It's about, I need to do what's best for Shauntice in this moment. But then when I do things like this, or talking just with other friends who also have metastatic disease, and we're talking about, different trials that we've been in or things that we're considering, you do think in the back of your head, there aren't very many people who look like me who are doing this. And then again, I'm in a unique position because I work at the place that I'm actually getting taken care of from. So I can walk to my appointment if I need to. It's not that much of a burden. So, sometimes I don't know if I necessarily always want to wear that cape though.
I understand that. But I do think it's great that as an African American woman that you are participating in these clinical trials, especially like Dr. Zelnak shared, there is a shortage of minority representation in these, and it's extremely important that we are represented. So I thank you on behalf of the breast cancer community that we serve here in Atlanta for your participation.
Thanks.
Okay, so Dr. Zelnak, This question is for you. In what ways have you seen clinical trials adapt to COVID? Has there been any flexibility in remote testing or interviewing or anything like that?
Sure. So before I answer that, I just want to tell Dr. Allen how awesome it is that your scans yesterday looked great. That's just, I know for you, just fantastic.
Yeah,
So, sure. So research during COVID has been tricky, to say the least. So, from my own personal experience, a number of the clinical trials that we had open closed temporarily to accrual because the sponsors, whether it was the NCI or the pharmaceutical companies, were worried about how were they going to be able to assess their drugs during COVID, right? So I know you heard Dr. Allen mention that maybe vacation was going to impact her ability to get to her scans on time. Well, that's vacation, but COVID has been just a whole nother thing in terms of the difficulties in making sure everybody gets their testing on time and all that goes into that. So thankfully, I think just in the past couple months, we've seen things open back up from a research perspective. I think the studies that were temporarily closed to new accruals have reopened, but I think when you look across the country, clinical trial accrual has really dropped off over the past couple months because of COVID. Thankfully, like I said, it's rebounding, which has been good. But COVID has made it definitely complicated, to say the least, both in terms of care for our patients that aren't on studies and then also, for the clinical trials. Did you have any other specific questions? I mean, I think that's, COVID's just made everything more complicated.
No, and I think
So the one other thing to mention from the research perspective, many of these pharmaceutical trials are monitored by people that live out of town, right? So they will send people to monitor how the study is progressing at an individual site. And so I think that's been one of the reasons why there were holds on accruals as well, because the person who lives in North Carolina is not hopping on a plane to come to Georgia or Alabama to look at the data. So I think that's been one of the issues too, which thankfully is getting better as well.
Thank you. And we have our last question for today's series. And so that question is for Dr. Zelnak. And the question is, are there any clinical trials for triple positive MBC patients?
Sure. So there have been several trials that have specifically been looking at patients that have both hormone receptor positive and HER2 positive breast cancer. Typically, they're looking at adding in targeted therapies to HER2 directed therapy. So one that comes to mind is adding in the drug abemaciclib, which is one of the CDK4/6 inhibitors, to endocrine therapy treatment along with trastuzumab. But typically, most of the HER2 positive studies that you see are for both patients with hormone receptor negative and hormone receptor positive HER2 positive breast cancer. So you'll see kind of an even split for those studies. But certainly as we see more drugs that are specifically for ER positive breast cancer, you can see a niche. And certainly like this data recently that was presented for early stage breast cancer where they used abema with hormone therapy for the HER2 negative patients that showed an improvement. They're now looking at doing a similar study in the triple positive patients. So I think you'll see more of it. But for now, the bulk of the studies are really for HER2 positive disease are looking at all comers.
Okay, great. And then just touching on the issue of maximum tolerated dose, has there been any movement in the field for figuring out the most effective dose rather than just saying the maximum tolerated dose?
I think that gets tricky as well. And Dr. Allen certainly can speak to this too, because she's been on a number of phase 1 studies. But I think the way the studies are still being designed is they're looking at what's the highest dose that we can give safely. And then they're moving that forward into the larger phase 2 and phase 3 trials. You will see sometimes as they get more patients, that you can look at patients that require dose reductions and see whether or not that those patients did just as well with the treatment. But that has not shifted. That shift to most effective dose has not happened in the phase 1 setting, right? Because they don't have enough patients on those trials to really look at it. So it's not until you get to these bigger trials where you see it. So certainly, like with a drug like palbociclib or the CDK4/6 inhibitors, where up to a third of patients were dose reduced, they had large numbers of patients that were treated on those trials with lower doses. So they had enough people to actually say, look, 100 milligrams looks to be just as good as 125. And so I think that has made people more comfortable with those lower doses. But thus far, I haven't seen a shift with the phase 1 trial design.
Either have I.
Yeah. It's hard once they have that mold for what a phase 1 trial looks like. They really want to see the dose that they think is the highest dose that they can give safely, because they do feel like that has the best chance of being effective when they move it into a larger patient population. So you really can't look at that effective versus maximum dose until you have more patients to treat.
Thank you, Dr. Allen and Dr. Zelnak. That wraps up our Q&A session. And so I just wanted to thank you both again for your participation. We're so grateful for the knowledge and expertise that you have shared with our attendees tonight. Thank you on behalf of Komen Atlanta, our partners, and our planning committee. We could not do this without each of you. And I want to take another minute to thank our sponsors. So thank you again to Northside Hospital, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, AZI, Athenex Oncology, AstraZeneca, Puma Biotechnology, Seattle Genetics, Myriad Genetics, Walgreens, and Cancer Treatment Centers of America. Please join us for our next event in the series on Metastatic Breast Cancer Awareness Day, which is next Tuesday, October 13th at noon Eastern Standard Time. And that series will be hosted by Komen Charlotte, The information will be updated in Whova to reflect this event. So check your Whova app and join us for the session on quality of life issues, featuring a panel of individuals living with MBC and an integrative medicine physician. And while I have you here, I just want to let everyone know that this Saturday, Komen Atlanta will be hosting their virtual More Than Pink Walk, so feel free to join us for that event. It can be viewed on our Facebook page, which is Susan G. Komen, Greater Atlanta. We would love to have feedback on today's session. Please make sure that you go to the survey link in the chat feature and take a few minutes to complete that. And if you stick around, please be sure to visit our exhibit booths where you can engage with our partners and our sponsors. And you can also connect with others in the MBC community, patients and caregivers, by posting questions or responses on the community message boards. And these are going to be available 24 hours a day. So we encourage engagement throughout the entire series. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and to all who made this event possible, we thank you again. Dr. Zelnak, Dr. Allen, we cannot thank you enough for your participation this evening. So everyone stay safe, and we will stay connected through the message boards, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you.